Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingrassia.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast. I'm really glad you could be with me today for part 2 of the sexual alliance, which we started last week. And we've learned that the sexual alliance is this concept that God intends for a couple, a man and a woman, a husband and a wife, to enter into a sexual alliance with one another in the context of marriage, where their sexual gift belongs exclusively to one another, which means my body belongs to you, my penis, my orgasm, my eyes, my hands, my sexual interest and attention and focus 100% is committed to you, my spouse, my wife, and vice versa, from the wife to the husband. So it's God's intention that a couple have this sexual alliance, this commitment of sexual exclusivity 100% with one another. And I'm covering 19 principles of the sexual alliance, and in our first episode of the sexual alliance, I covered the first 4. Number 1 is the definition of the sexual alliance. Number 2 was the biblical basis for the sexual alliance. I shared 3 proof texts. Number 3, most couples assume that they have a sexual alliance. Number 4, the sexual alliance that many couples assume they have is often way too vague. And number 5, the sexual alliance often fails when the reality of life sets in. And that's where we left off last time on principle number 5. The sexual alliance often fails when the reality of life sets in. And we learned that although most people have a kind of sincerity when they get married, a sincere intention to limit the expression of their sexual gift exclusively with their spouse, what happens is that in a short matter of time, for many, if not most couples, the reality of life sets in, the difficulty of life, the challenges of life and of relationship, and this often causes a kind of tension within the context of a marriage, and in a short matter of time, therefore, one, if not both of the partners are tempted to begin to express their sexual gift outside of the bounds of their commitment to exclusivity with their spouse. And last time we considered 2 examples. Number 1 was the reality that sometimes one spouse is higher sexed than the other, and therefore out of frustration they begin to express their sexual gift and treat themselves to bonus orgasms, and they feel justified in doing this because they're not getting enough sex and as many orgasms as they would like from their partner. And example number 2 had to do with this concept of what I call sexual rhythm, and the idea that this young man has a sexual rhythm that's much higher than his wife is aware of, and even though she's available to him sexually, it still isn't enough for him, and so he's tempted to act out and help himself to bonus orgasms, and he therefore begins to express his sexual gift apart from his wife, and thereby violating the sexual alliance that's intended to exist between the two of them in the context of their marriage. And that therefore brings me to my 3rd example of our 5th point. Again, the 5th point is the sexual alliance often fails when the reality of life sets in. In this example, a young husband's job requires him to be on the computer virtually all day, every day. In addition, he spends a significant amount of time on the computer when he gets home from work to attend to his personal life and interest and activities. And he happens to be a night owl. His wife tends to go to bed earlier than he does. He isn't tired yet, so he sits up. He ends up on his computer late at night for various reasons. And inevitably, therefore, and frequently, there's this never-ending parade of pop-up invitations and solicitations to visit this site or that site, to chat with this person or that person, or to subscribe to this service or that service, or to watch this video or that video on YouTube. And although he sincerely attempts to resist these never-ending solicitations and opportunities, the overwhelming, perpetual, and constant parade in front of his eyes is simply too much to resist, and in a moment of weakness one evening, he dares to click on one of these links. And although on this night he stays for only a few minutes, in the weeks and months to come, he finds himself going back to these sites more often and visiting for much longer periods of time. And then the combination of the temptation to look and the virtually instant access that's constantly there, only a click or two away, it's simply too much to resist. And his secret relationship with pornography and masturbation becomes deeply established in his life. And in so doing, he's now acting out and expressing his sexual gift apart from his wife, which is a violation of the sexual alliance, because now his sexual gift does not belong exclusively to his wife. And by the way, I should just mention, in view of the example that I just offered of the young husband, it could just as well have been illustrated in the life of a young wife, because we now know that the use of internet pornography is drastically escalating among females, and an estimated 30% of all internet pornography that's viewed is now viewed by females. And just one more example number 4 of this point, as inevitably occurs in virtually every relationship, right? There's differences of opinion, misunderstandings, miscommunications, and hurt feelings. As these relational offenses accumulate over time, there's a growing sense of distance and disconnection and relational coolness and hurt for one particular married couple. And for whatever reasons, they find it difficult to communicate. It's hard to talk about these things, and it seems like every time they try to talk, it ends with more frustration, more hurt, more misunderstanding, more alienation. So as the relational distance between them grows over time, so does their intimate and sexual connection. And although at one time, years ago, they were expectant and devoted lovers, it now seems almost impossible for them to connect with one another or to enjoy one another sexually. In addition, their relational dynamics have led her to believe that all he ever wants from her is sex, and for him to believe that she's using sex to punish him and manipulate him. And as a result of these relational dynamics, the sexual contact between the two of them is now very infrequent to almost non-existent, and they're therefore left each on their own to fend for themselves. So his sexual default mechanism is to use internet pornography and masturbation, while she reads romance novels and finds herself struggling with a growing attraction toward a man at work who seems to enjoy her company. Do they really think that because they're no longer sexual with each other, that they're therefore not still both sexual persons with sexual needs and desires? And does it ever occur to them to be curious about what the other person must be doing or might be doing with the expression of their sexual gift and sexual energy? Or said another way, does it ever occur to them, gee, we almost never have sex in our marriage anymore. Am I to assume, therefore, that my husband is just non-sexual, that he's not doing anything with his body, with his sexual desire, with his penis, with his orgasm? And you guys, I don't want to be mean here. I'm just thinking out loud, but I'm being honest, and I'm speaking this with love. But it's just amazing to me, as a pastor and a professional counselor, the level of naivete that exists in so many people's lives. You know, human beings have this remarkable capacity for denial and for rationalization and for minimization and for pretending like something doesn't exist. You know, that old metaphor of the purple elephant or the pink elephant that lives in our house, but everybody pretends like there's no pink elephant. What pink elephant? What are you talking about? And this couple virtually never has sex with one another, or very, very little sex with one another, and yet apparently they assume of one another that their spouse is living without any sex or any expression of orgasm. And I'll just tell you that in my humble opinion, more often than not, especially for men, men are not going to live without their orgasm for any sustained period of time. And therefore, if it ain't happening with my wife, chances are people are indulging in other expressions of their sexual self, and they're taking their sexual interest and energy and expression to other things outside of their marriage, outside the context of their relationship with their spouse, and therefore there no longer exists a sexual alliance because these people are expressing their sexual selves in many different ways apart from their spouse. And so we can see that although most couples begin their relationship with the sincere intention and assumption that they're only going to have sex with each other in the context of their marriage relationship, oh yes, we'll have a sexual alliance with each other when we get married, we also see that for many, if not for most couples, the assumption is seriously tested by the reality of life and the difficulties of relationship, and as a result, many married people, if not most married people, begin to express and experience their sexual gifts apart from their spouse, at least part of the time, if not much of the time, in a variety of different ways. And that brings us to principle number 6 of the sexual alliance, which is this. Many couples, if not most couples, do not have a true sexual alliance. And the reason that many couples do not have a true sexual alliance is because, as noted in the previous examples of relational difficulty, one person or the other, if not both of them, end up expressing their sexual gift apart from the other person. And we could illustrate this concept in a couple different ways. And when I teach you guys, I normally use a PowerPoint, and I use a lot of pictures and illustrations and video clips. So in the context of the podcast, it's a little bit challenging because I can only use my words. So I'll do my very best here. But imagine for this metaphor that there's 2 different circles, if you will. One is blue, which represents the man. He's the blue circle. And one is pink, which is the wife. She's the pink circle. And now overlap these 2 circles. The ideal, you see, God's plan and intention is that the 2 circles would perfectly align on top of one another 100%, which means the expression of the sexual gift belongs exclusively to one another. But what ends up happening in many situations is that the 2 circles do not align perfectly with one another. So picture maybe the 2 circles halfway covering one another. So a big portion of my circle is covering your circle, which means that much of my sexual gift and sexual expression belongs to you, my wife. I bring out my sexual gift with you. But notice there's this rather significant part of my circle that is not overlapping my wife, which means all over here are ways and times and areas where I express my sexual gift apart from my wife. Or, in other words, most of my sexual gift belongs to you as my spouse, but all of my sexual gift does not belong exclusively to you 100% of the time. And this second illustration might be even a little bit harder to describe, but I'll just do my best. Picture that the man's circle is blue, and it's a certain size, and now take the pink circle and put it inside the man's circle, but it's smaller than the man's circle. And in view of that, we can detect from this metaphor that the wife, in other words, is 100% committed to her husband in the sexual alliance. In other words, she does not express her sexual gift apart from her husband. Her whole circle is over his circle, but his circle is bigger than his wife's circles, which means that part of his circle is outside of his wife. They're not overlapping. So you see, this illustrates that one person is keeping their sexual self exclusively to their spouse, but the other person is not keeping themselves exclusively sexually to their spouse, which means that there are times that this person is expressing and experiencing their sexual gift apart from their spouse. And in either one of these scenarios, this is a dynamic that I affectionately refer to as stealing orgasms, or helping yourself to bonus orgasms, or double dipping. And I hope this is not necessarily shocking to you, and I'm sorry if I'm the one that has to break the bad news to you, but I suspect that the stealing of orgasms is a reality, if not in most marriages, at least in many marriages. And so what many people end up doing is to metaphorically put one foot on their spouse and one foot on their own secret, clandestine sexual activities, and it's as if their reasoning is something like this: I'm going to get as many orgasms as I can get from my spouse, but since that still isn't as many orgasms as I would prefer, I'm just going to go ahead and get my bonus orgasms over here to make up the difference, and I'm going to take care of this myself. And that brings me to principle number 7, which I'm calling questions about the sexual alliance. So with the distance, the material that we've covered on this concept of the sexual alliance this far, up to these 6 principles, and stay with me because I have a total of 19 principles to cover, but just with the foundation of the first 6 principles, I want to, at this point, ask some questions about this concept of the sexual alliance. And these questions are intended to you if you're a married person, and if you're not married, as a person who might be married one day. But here's a series of questions concerning this idea of the sexual alliance. And although I'm sure that I could ask many more questions, I've chosen just 12 for our purpose here. Question 1. Do you believe in the concept of the sexual alliance? Question 2. Do you believe that a married couple should limit the expression of their corresponding sexual gifts exclusively with each other? Question 3. Do you believe that your sexual gift belongs to your spouse and your spouse's sexual gift belongs to you? Number 4. Do you believe that you should only have orgasms with your spouse and that your spouse should only have orgasms with you? Question 5. Do you believe that watching porn or masturbation apart from your spouse constitutes a violation of your sexual commitment to your spouse? Number 6. Have you been faithful in keeping your sexual commitment to your spouse? Number 7. Do you believe your spouse has been faithful in keeping their sexual commitment to you? Number 8. Have you been intimately and sexually available to your spouse on a consistent and regular basis? Number 9. Do you ever use sex as a weapon against your spouse or as a way to punish, control, or manipulate them? Number 10. Do you believe it's God's will, plan, and design for you and your spouse to have a true sexual alliance? Number 11. If you know the sexual alliance with your spouse has not been what it should be, are you interested in reestablishing a true sexual alliance with your spouse? And number 12, Are you open to the possibility and interested in working on the sexual alliance with your spouse as you seek to bring the expression of your sexual selves under the authority and the blessing of God? And that brings us to principle number 8 of the sexual alliance, which is this: every couple must decide if they want a true sexual alliance. Now, you guys know what I think and believe. As I've already suggested, I believe it's God's will and plan and purpose and design for every married couple to have a sexual alliance with each other. And by the way, you should know that as the presenter of this session, my wife and I, Sherry and I, have had a true sexual alliance for the past 16 years and 10 months, which means that for the past 16 years and 10 months, as of the day that I'm recording this episode of the podcast, I have not had a single expression of my sexual gift. I have not had an orgasm apart from my wife for 16 years and 10 months. Which means that Sherry and I both recognize and embrace God's design for human sexuality. We believe that our sexual gifts belong exclusively 100% to one another, and that we should express and experience our sexual gifts exclusively with one another, and that we are to be sexually available to one another on a frequent and recurring basis, which, by the way, is essentially the definition of the sexual alliance, which I just quoted, which is principle 1 of the sexual alliance, the definition. So all this leads to a very important question. Do you want to have a sexual alliance with your spouse? And are you willing to commit to a sexual alliance, or are you willing to recommit to a sexual alliance if in fact you realize that there has been a violation of your sexual alliance in the context of your marriage? And this is something that only you and your spouse can decide for your marriage. I can't decide it for your marriage. I can only decide it for my marriage. And by the way, with that being said, I would at least advocate for the truth in your marriage, meaning that if you're going to decide to not have a true sexual alliance, when you understand what I'm suggesting by this concept of the sexual alliance, which I believe isn't my concept, it's God's concept of how He intends the gift of sex to happen in our lives within the context of our marriage, this sexual exclusivity. If you're going to decide, Tony, I disagree. I do not think that my sexual gift should belong exclusively to my wife. I think it's okay if, I have sex with her as much as I can, but, if I look at porn once in a while, if I masturbate by myself and my wife doesn't know, well, I think that that's okay. I do not agree with your definition of the sexual alliance. Well, of course, that's your decision to make, but what I'm saying is that I would at least advocate for the truth in your marriage, meaning that if you're not going to have a true sexual alliance with each other, then at least admit the truth to each other and live in the light with each other, because at least that's a more honest way to live with one another. In other words, if you're going to look at porn, if you're going to masturbate, or experience any other kinds or expressions of your sexual gift apart from your partner, or if you're going to have orgasms apart from your partner in any way, for any reason, at least do so with the complete knowledge of your spouse. In that way, at least there's no secrets. There's no pretense. There's no pretending. There's no lying. There's no misrepresentation. It's what's really happening in your marriage anyway. You're stealing orgasms. You're getting bonus orgasms apart from your spouse. So shouldn't the two of you at least be honest about who you really are and what your marriage really looks like and what your sexual lives really look like and what your marriage really looks like? In other words, who are you really fooling by any dishonesty or pretense or subterfuge that may exist in your marriage? Therefore, you're no longer going to use the ostrich technique in your marriage, where you bury your head in the sand, and that way you see no evil, hear no evil, and speak no evil, and everything seems okay on the outside, even though it's not really okay on the inside. And although the two of you are living as if you do have a sexual alliance, the reality is that you do not have a sexual alliance in your marriage. And I'm therefore advocating that you at least be honest with each other. And that therefore brings me to principle number 9 of the sexual alliance. And by the way, when I started this series of episodes, the sexual alliance, I gave a disclaimer at the beginning saying that I was going to get into some points and some material that might be disruptive to some people and alarming and even upsetting. And we're approaching some of this content now. So I'm just going to ask you to just listen with an open heart and an open mind and at least consider the possibility of what I'm suggesting here, because I really do believe that these principles are based on biblical truth. And so principle number 9 is this: the sexual alliance will give you the opportunity to come clean with one another. In short, if you're going to agree and commit to have a sexual alliance with each other from this day forward, it essentially is implying something or suggesting something, which is this: that you have not had a true sexual alliance with each other in the past. In other words, at this point, if a man is going to bring this concept to his wife and say, honey, I want to talk to you about this, or let's listen to this podcast together so that you comprehend this idea that I'm learning about the sexual alliance, and I want to suggest that we enter into this sexual alliance with one another. Well, you see, there's a risk in doing that, right? Because chances are your wife has been assuming this whole time that a sexual alliance already exists between the two of you. So when you come to her to suggest to her that you want to enter into a sexual alliance, or essentially you kind of want to hit a reset button and recommit to the sexual alliance with your spouse in your marriage, it could be alarming and upsetting to them because they've assumed that the sexual alliance already exists. So when you suggest the possibility of the sexual alliance, you see, it implies that one of you or both of you have been expressing your sexual gift apart from your spouse, because you're suggesting to your spouse, I don't want to do that anymore. Let's make a sexual alliance and recommit sexual exclusivity to one another. Therefore, the suggestion or the possibility of the sexual alliance will give both of you the opportunity to come clean with one another about who you really are sexually and what you've really been doing with your sexual self, whether your spouse knows it or doesn't know it. And again, this is where the idea of the sexual alliance starts to get pretty tricky, and why many people are afraid of the sexual alliance, and why many people at this point might bow out and say, Tony, you're crazy. There's no way I'm going to disclose to my wife the fact that I have not been limiting the expression of my sexual gift to my wife in the context of the marriage. And by the way, it's this principle that helps us see why it's easier for a new couple to establish a sexual alliance with each other than an existing couple that's already married, because a new couple, in a sense, has a clean slate from which to start. But an existing married couple already has an established track record within the history of their marriage. So for them to decide to establish the sexual alliance at a particular point in their marriage implicates what's been happening up to that point in the context of the marriage. You see, it's very possible that somebody in your marriage has been under the false assumption that the sexual alliance, though essentially unspoken, has already existed between the two of you and has, in fact, been in place your entire married life since you guys got married. In other words, they've been living in such a way that they've been limiting the expression of their sexual gift to their spouse, and they therefore, albeit naively so, have assumed that their spouse has also been limiting the expression of their sexual gift within the context of the marriage. Therefore, when one of you or both of you have to admit to the other that you've been expressing your sexual gift apart from the other, it may lead to one of you or both of you being very surprised or shocked or upset or hurt or angry or all of the above when this person learns that their spouse has in fact not had a sexual alliance and they have been expressing their sexual gift apart from their spouse. The sexual alliance therefore becomes your opportunity to come clean with each other, to repent before each other, and to confess to one another that you, in fact, have not had a sexual alliance with each other, that your spouse has not been the sole object of your sexual gift, and to ask forgiveness of one another. And although this can be a very scary thing to do, I do believe that it's the right thing to do, and you have to trust God to work deeply and powerfully in one another's hearts and lives as you come into the light with each other, as you come clean with one another, and as you move toward establishing a true sexual alliance with one another. And I've therefore taken the liberty of writing out just an example of what it might look like, what the verbiage might look like and sound like if you make this decision to come clean with your spouse. So it might sound something like this. Honey, in view of our consideration of the sexual alliance, I must confess to you that at times I've been tempted to express my sexual gift apart from you, even though we've been married for the past 22 years. And the fact is that I've done so many times, primarily by looking at porn and masturbation. I guess I never really thought about it that much, and I didn't really understand how wrong it was for me to do that. But now I'm learning a new understanding of what God wants from me and what God wants for our marriage in the sexual areas of our lives. And I really want to honor God, and I want to honor you as my spouse with my sexual self from this day forward. I never want to steal another orgasm apart from you, and I want my sexual gift to belong exclusively to you from this day forward. So I'm asking for your forgiveness for the ways that I violated our marriage covenant by stealing orgasms and by expressing my sexual self apart from you, and I never want to do it again, and that's why I'm interested in the sexual alliance, and that's why I'm interested and I'm open in reestablishing a sexual alliance with you as my spouse from this day forward. And that's the end of my role play example there. And one final thought I'd like to share with you concerning this idea of coming clean with your spouse, especially for those of you who might think this is just an absolutely crazy idea. And my thought is this: it's better to tell on yourself than it is to get caught. You know, I'm a pastor, and I'm also a licensed professional counselor, so I get to work with a lot of people and a lot of married couples, and I'm in kind of a unique position in my life and my ministry and the job that I do, kind of like a mechanic. You bring the car in, and he lifts up the hood, and he gets to look under the hood. Well, I get to look inside of people's lives and situations and marriages. I get to look under the hood, and I see these situations over and over and over again, essentially where people get caught. They get caught acting out. Their spouse thought that they had a sexual alliance. It turns out their spouse has been acting out and expressing their sexual gift in these different ways. They finally get caught. They're exposed. Now they're in big trouble. Maybe they end up coming to counseling. And what I'm suggesting here is that it's far, far better to tell on yourself than it is to get caught. And even though it might be incredibly difficult to come into the light with your spouse, to voluntarily do so with the intent of establishing a true sexual alliance with each other will, in the long run, be far better and far healthier than continuing to keep your sexual secrets from one another and continuing to act out, and then eventually getting caught, which typically leads to an even deeper sense of hurt and betrayal and mistrust. Because getting caught implies that not only have you been duplicitous and keeping secrets from your spouse, but that you would have continued to be duplicitous and to keep secrets forever. And the only reason your spouse knows what you were doing now is because they finally caught you, because you never chose to come clean on your own initiative, and the truth was in fact discovered only when you were finally caught by your spouse. And although coming clean can be profoundly scary and difficult, it's far better and far healthier than getting caught, and a necessary step to establishing a true sexual alliance between you and your spouse. And with that being said, you guys, I see from the clock that we're out of time, so I'm going to have to wrap up this episode of the Power of Purity podcast. Thank you so much for being with me today. We've got 19 principles to cover of the sexual alliance, and we've now covered the first 9. Come back with me. I can't wait to see you in the next episode, and we will continue with principle number 10 of the sexual alliance. God bless you. Have an awesome day.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.